Hello again, everybody, and welcome once more to the Explaining History podcast. And I am delighted to be joined by Bruce Tapper today, who has written a new and fascinating inclusive guide to world history. And we are going to kind of explore that in just a moment and look at the kind of the big chronological sweep through history. It's slightly bigger than what we would normally talk about on the Explaining History podcast. I normally talk about 19th and 20th century history, but looking at the complete chronological picture of human history in an accessible way is a fascinating and really, I guess, kind of ambitious sort of project. So firstly, welcome, Bruce. It's lovely to have you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, lovely to be here. I'm very excited to be on your podcast.
Yes, indeed. So let's just talk about the project to begin with. How did the book come about?
Okay, yeah, that's almost a long question as the book. So look, I'm in my early 50s and I don't even have a history O level. So I want to put that out there straight away. And it's probably part of that is why I wrote the book. As I matured, the idea first came to me at university in my 20s. I did a Bachelor of Science. And I realized then that I didn't have that much of a knowledge of history because I hadn't done a history O level and I hadn't studied it after school. And I just realized that there was the basic sort of overview, something which you used earlier, and a helpful framework. And that's what I wanted to put together. I wanted just to have the basic understanding of what had happened when. And there were some simple questions out there. It's not just human history, by the way. I do start at the Big Bang, but that's covered in the first two chapters. So pretty much from chapter 3 to chapter 10, it is human history. But, basic questions such as, how long after the dinosaurs went extinct did humans come about? How long was the Stone Age? When was the Stone Age in relation to Julius Caesar? And just then I realized that's what was needed, was a sort of chronological time line without too much detail.
I think in terms of chronology, placing things in that sort of context can be very interesting and instructive. I mean, if you look at the amount of time that human beings were hunter-gatherers compared to the amount of time human beings have lived in modernity, it kind of explains a lot about us, really, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I mean, you can just look at the book, and I was speaking to my mum the other day, and she's just got it, and she started reading it. And I was trying to explain to her, when it's going to get more interesting for her, because she was after a specific period, like post-Renaissance. And I said, look, that's right. You've got to get through the first of 2 or 3 chapters to get to that. But it's quite interesting, almost half the book, or a third of the book is just from 1900 onwards. So it just shows you how much has gone on in more recent terms and in relation to the rest.
Well, yeah. I was reading, as I tend to do, I was rereading Eric Hobsbawm, his Age of Revolution. And he was talking about the significance of the Industrial Revolution. And he said, essentially, after the discovery of agriculture, it was the most important thing to ever happen in human history. And of course, he died 2 or 3 years ago, I think. No doubt people will write in and correct me on that one. He's one of those people that you think he died 2 or 3 years ago, and bam, it's 10 years ago, and you're older. But he died before, the beginnings of artificial intelligence. And future historians will no doubt look at where we are at now as some kind of pivotal kind of moment in history.
Absolutely.
If you were looking at human history from where from your perspective of what you've read and written, what would you say are these kind of fundamental moments in the development of humanity?
There are 2 that spring to mind. And they're probably the periods that I really, when I was writing or researching, I should say, it just sort of, they jumped out at me as going, wow, that's an interesting time. The first one is sort of 750 BC. And what you saw happening there was the emergence of certain religions. So you had Confucianism, you had Buddhism, all emerging at pretty much the same time, and it was quite strange. And this is pre-Christianity, obviously, but they all came about within, when you look at it from now, within a fairly short time frame of each other. It's probably hundreds of years, but still, that came about then. And then the next one was just the Renaissance period and post-humanity, or humanism, when suddenly people were looking more inwards rather than out at nation building. And I found those sort of periods very, very interesting, and how they sort of, things happen. I look at patterns sometimes, and things were happening in completely different parts of the world. It might be Buddhism in what would be Central Asia, Confucianism happening across in China. But they happened at a similar time. And the same with the Renaissance. You found things are suddenly spreading around the world and from a particular area.
My guess is that the simple way of explaining that is people were more mobile than we thought. And I think there's a belief sometimes that if you were in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, or living in pre Christian era, that you stayed in your village, and that was that, which I think is being increasingly disproven. But I guess the reason why you get Confucianism and Buddhism and these philosophical revolutions appearing in different parts of the world at similar times is human mobility. People walking back and forth saying, well, where I come from, there's been this very interesting idea, and it's sparking other, ripples of other ideas, perhaps. I mean, that's just a guess, by the way. Anthropologists, please don't write it.
No, I think you're probably quite correct.
One of my favorite books of the last 10 years was David Graeber's Debt: The First 5,000 Years, which I'm not sure whether you've read it or not. But in that, he puts kind of debt, the creation of the idea of debt, as one of the kind of central kind of economic themes of human history. And the idea that debt goes from being a sort of a thing that people, that early peoples kind of had, I owe you this and you owe me that, and it'll all kind of work itself out, which is a very, very common sort of phenomenon, to debt becoming, and as religions rose, a sort of, in some ways, a moral issue, thou shalt not owe,
Sure.
3 swine to thy brothers, so and so. And also debt being an instrument of government. And I wonder how much, excuse me, I beg your pardon. From what you've written and read, where does a kind of economic history sort of appear in what you've looked at?
Look, what I'd like to do, if I may, is sort of jump in and just give us sort of a little bit more of an overview of how the timeline works. And what I try not to do is get subjective on any particular subject, whether it's the rights and wrongs of debt, or whether it's war or whatever. And it's more just trying to put together that chronological timeline, and I'll explain why I did it. One of the things that a friend of mine said to me recently, he said, look, what you've done is you've done all this research and then you've arranged it. And one of the reasons you've done it is to try and make sense of the world. And I think that was quite a correct sort of observation there. The way I see it, as we mature, we all see things in a different light. And we started to understand, both as peoples and leaders and nations, that a lot of our current actions, if not most, are based on past experiences.
Mm-hmm.
You can go into a lot more detail and discuss things like debt or, people's mobility. And I haven't done that in the book. What I've done is I've just tried to give a sort of overview of these past experience and how they've maybe then led to another event. So the way I sort of see it is that, people are often afraid to look at their own past, not even history, history of humans or history of the world. They're even afraid to look at their own past, and they don't want to consider general history when they discuss world events. They sort of see that as a weight on their shoulders, or they might perhaps feel that history is boring. But I definitely see it in a completely different manner. For me, the way I see it is, on a personal basis, we are where we are because as a direct result of things that we have done in the past. And we might spend a lot of time lamenting this. We know, if I hadn't done this, or if I had done that, I'd be here or I'd be there. But what you've got to do at the end of the day is you've got to take direct responsibility for your own actions and say, I am where I am because of what I did. And I think when it comes to world history, I'm not expecting anyone to go out there and change the world. But I do believe that once they do understand the history of the world, or have a better overview of the history of the world, if I put it that way, then it gives them a better feeling of where they are now. and
Hmm.
then and where we as humans are now, and what it stops us doing. And I've seen this both in myself and I've seen this in other individuals. When you get a slightly better idea of the timeline of events, or just where things fit into place, a jigsaw puzzle of history, for example, then maybe you don't get quite upset by a specific event like Israel, Gaza, or Russia, Ukraine, or inter-party politics, or just the news in general. You start
Mm.
sort of getting a better understanding of it, not getting too upset about it.
Sure.
Um, and that's where I'm coming from, rather than going down into detail of why something would have happened.
Sure. Sure. And I think that there's something very important in that. Um, Obviously, I mean, I think that it's, that it's that we don't live in a history but histories. We often siloed into histories. If you examine, say, for example, the history of the Second World War, the way somebody in Russia views that story to the way somebody in Japan or Germany or Great Britain views it, it's almost a completely separate narrative with things happening in
100%.
different places, and
Absolutely.
and different sort of moral and political judgments made as a result. And what often happens is there's this kind of competition for often for victimhood. We had it harder than you, and we suffered more than you did, and that entitles us to X, Y, and Z action in the present moment. I suppose looking at a timeline helps you to create I suppose you could call a comparative history. Say, well, these things happened at around this time in different places, and they are of relatively similar importance, and happened to people in these particular ways. And perhaps it helps us to draw us away from those silos, because I think one of the great things about this subject is that you can examine what people who are comparatively alien to you, or comparatively from a kind of radically different culture and time, experienced as human beings,
Absolutely.
and why, and what that led to, and why, which is, um,
100%. I am. I mean, I think one of the what I do try and do, rather, during the timeline, I will try and throw in relevant facts there. So you just brought up a very good example of World War II and how different people can perceive it too in different ways. And at the end of the page or pages on World War II, I can't remember how many pages it was, I just put there a couple of lists. One of the lists might be, a list of people who were important, some of the generals. But one of the lists, which I do remember, and it jumps out now when you've just made that comment, is the deaths. And if you looked at, and I don't remember the exact figures, but if you look at the amount of people from Great Britain who died in World War II, it was roughly 500,000. If you look at the number of people from America who died in World War II, it was a little bit less than that. But if you then go and look at what was the USSR and how many people there died in World War II, it's 22 million.
mhm.
And by just sort of throwing it out there and putting that as a list at the end of it, it does allow people to then go, oh, that's interesting. I didn't necessarily know that. Let me go and read up a little bit more about that and try and understand, maybe a second side of World War II.
Yeah. Often when I used to teach the beginnings of the Cold War, the kind of the post-war conferences, you have Stalin, this kind of monstrous figure, and his inner advisors. But I used to teach it to my students in that, can you imagine what the perspective of Soviet politicians, generals, ordinary soldiers, and citizens were in 1945, having lost 22 million, which I think is actually, in some historians would put that as a conservative estimate. Some
Absolutely,
historians
yeah.
place that as high as 27 million, but figures for mass killings vary statistically depending on what model you use. But the ability to kind of, even for someone like Stalin to inhabit that worldview for a moment and see the enormity of what had occurred, it helps to make sense of of kind of future decisions in the Cold War. We can never allow a battle to take place on Soviet territory ever again, essentially. Um,
Absolutely. And I mean, I think this is where a timeline becomes quite handy, because if you are going to look at, for example, the events leading, or if you can look at World War II, you can't do it without looking at the events which led up to World War II. And you can't look at the events which led up to World War II without looking at World War One. And this is when I find just throwing, the timeline in works very, very well, and giving people an overview. And a lot of your audience, I mean, you've got people who are students of history listening, and they'll know much, much more than I do, for example. But my book is aimed at people who don't know history and aren't students of history. And hopefully what it's doing is just sparking an interest. You said something in your introduction, which I really, really liked. It was with regards to, we all need to understand history. It's part of us. We've all got it innate within us. In your introduction on the podcast, and that really struck me as being 100% correct. What I'm interested in doing is then working out the why. Why do we need to know this information? And I think that's where the timeline comes in quite handy, because it helps us understand what's going on now in relation to events which lead up to it.
I think it's partly to do with the fact that human beings understand things through stories. History is, as a humanity, is kind of distinct from lots of other disciplines, in that if you go all the way back to the first historians, or the first historians that we know of, the ancient Greeks, they really were telling exciting stories, and that were mixed with mythology and bits of guesswork and a few historical truths. And they told these exciting stories of the Odysseus and the Trojan Wars and things like that. And people enjoyed that. And throughout, in the Middle Ages, histories were written as kind of hagiographies to kings, saying, why is King Henry, was he not so fabulous at Agincourt, and all this sort of stuff. And so history itself, as a kind of an academic discipline, is maybe 150, perhaps tops 200 years old, where we've looked at the sources, and we've tried to shape stories into something more factual. But it's still, it's still about telling stories, just hopefully trying to tell us as realistic a story as you can do. Which is why, history is so contested. I mean, wherever you are in the world at the moment, there seem to be these kind of immense cultural struggles over the meaning of slavery, or kind of historical monuments, or that sort of thing. And it's because you have different power groups within society contesting the story, saying, no, that's not what the story was. But we love stories.
We do, 100%. One of the things that I quite liked about the book as well, some of the little sort of stories that jumped out as well. Well, when I say I liked about the book, I don't want to say I like my book, but I'm saying some of the when I was doing the research, some of the interesting bits that jumped out. I mean, from things like, we were talking about World War II, and that Nagasaki was never supposed to be bombed. It was just, haze on the day, which led to them deciding, well, they couldn't bomb the original city they were aiming for. And so therefore Nagasaki, which was, I think the original city was Kokura. And then they had to then decide, well, they obviously had a third city in mind already, but that ends up being Nagasaki. And I mean, it sounds like, general knowledge now, but can you imagine if you've got relatives who were there at the time, and you're feeling, well, they were never supposed to be bombed. And other interesting stories that jumped out. We talk today a lot about pollution, and we worry about climate change, or certain groups do, etc. But when we look at the Alvarez event, and the giant meteor that hit Mexico and wiped out the dinosaurs, that would happen 65 million years ago, but it took 4 million years for the Earth to recover after that. So it does put into perspective. I'm sure we are damaging the planet. I'm sure we're going to continue to damage the planet, but I think the planet will survive from it. And there were lots of stories that came out like that as I went through the book. I'll just add one more, which I found really fascinating. There's a chain of thought that says that Rasputin and his healing powers in 1917 onwards, part of it was due to the fact that aspirin had just been invented, and when he was working with Nicholas II, the Tsar, and the Tsarina Alexandra, he told them to get rid of all of their doctors and the other people who were helping. And what that did was it stopped people giving aspirin to their son, who obviously was a hemophiliac. And the fact that he stopped having aspirin, which is a blood thinner, no one knew it was a blood thinner at the time, made his blood less thin, which means he felt a little bit better. So small little things like that came out during my research, which that's fascinating. That sort of makes sense of something which I didn't know and had no clue about at all.
I had often wondered about the Rasputin story. But on pure dumb luck on which history
Absolutely.
kind of hinges from time to time, from time to time. Um, the
Or bad luck. Sometimes it's
well,
terrible bad luck.
well, yeah.
Also came out a few times in the book. I mean, Franz Ferdinand, World War II, he had been shot at, and then he drove off to carry on doing his duties, and then decided to go back and visit the soldiers who'd been injured during the shooting at him, and his driver took him back through the same place where the first assassination had occurred, and some of the other assassins were waiting there, and this time they got him, and that was just silly luck, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe there's something more behind it that we don't know.
Well,
But it is amazing when you look at these stories how they come out.
yeah, I mean, when you look at in that particular story, when you look at the assassins, they were these young men. I think all of them had tuberculosis. They were
Yes,
malnourished, sort of kind of runts of the litter almost, and almost weren't expected to achieve anything at all. They were sort of recruited on the off chance that they might possibly, succeed, but they were kind of kept around as a sort of a general nuisance, and by sheer kind of happenstance and the sort of poor judgment on the day. And I think the car broke down close to a certain point where, or it stalled or they got stuck. And the all the chances of shooting Franz Ferdinand had failed, except for the fact that it basically stopped next to Gavrilo Princip, who thought, well, let's have a go.
here's my chance.
And yeah, here's my chance. Um, I read there was an amazing book, and I recommend it to all who are listening. A history of the causes of 9/11, and obviously, and a lot is written about 9/11. Conspiracy theory stuff, and you have to be very careful because you can wind up chasing your tail for years on end with all this kind of stuff. And I try to avoid conspiracy theories on here, and I particularly like this book because as an explanation for 9/11, it presents a kind of what I would call a structural explanation. There's all sorts of funny things about 9/11 that perhaps we'll never get to the bottom of, passports winding up here and there, and things that just don't seem to make sense. But this offers a really good explanation. It's a book called The Looming Tower. And it says essentially that the CIA and the FBI would not cooperate with one another in the weeks and the months running up to 9/11. Policemen, the FBI are policemen, they like to arrest people and put them in prison. And the CIA are spies and they like to spy on people and in some cases not arrest them so they can continue doing the spying. And both sides had one piece of the puzzle each. And had they put the pieces together, they would have had the names and the images of the hijackers and they could have arrested them. But
Fascinating.
neither side, they refused to do so. I think post 9/11, one of the reasons why they created the Department of Homeland Security is so all this information would be pooled. And one of the so a reasonable explanation is, well, you have these kinds of internal power struggles within institutions where they wrestle with one another, and sometimes the result is something truly terrible. But there's no doubt all sorts of other kind of aspects to it as well. But
Absolutely. But it's interesting. I mean, that's a little story like that. I mean, I hadn't heard that, and if I had, I definitely would have tried to put it somewhere in, because one of the questions I get asked is, where does the title come from? And it's Bruce's timeline of our world, and the reason I put Bruce's in there is not from some sort of point of vanity. Actually, it's completely opposite. It's more a case of any timeline you're going to do, there's going to be something you've left out, or somebody's going to say you should have done it like that. So I had to put it as, okay, this is my timeline, and that's all it is. It's something which I personally feel has just sort of got most of the information, or most of the events or people that I think people should know about, and I'm pretty sure I've left out one or two, and that's fantastic. When I get feedback on the website or through this, great. Then we'll bring out a second edition and we'll try and work out what we should put in, and maybe there'll be little anecdotes like that, which I then also include. And I've tried to put in some anecdotes, but like I said, I've always been non-subjective, just telling people what happened and why, and then throwing in some facts here and there.
yeah, yeah, and I think creating that framework means that for somebody who thinks, well, I'd like to know more about the First World War, there's a kind of like a leaping off place for them to kind of pursue that. Um, and I think that unless you have that sort of thing that goes beyond sort of academia, it goes beyond study, it goes beyond high school, and it goes out to people who maybe never get to engage with history or the past at all, and who might feel, they walk into the history department of Waterstones and just feel totally daunted and overwhelmed, and it's really unfortunate. Having a kind of a concise kind of timeline to begin navigating the past, I think is a really, really useful thing. So I hope we'll get onto the little plug bit in a while, but I hope this will be a really good tool for some of the listeners to use.
I hope so too.
Which period did you find the most kind of engaging, the most, wow, that captures my kind of imagination?
I definitely loved the Reformation. I liked. I mean, I'd seen the Medici series on Netflix, or I don't know if I saw it on Netflix or where I saw it, but the Medici series, which came out a few years ago, I really enjoyed that. So I've always been quite fascinated by that. So getting into it and just understanding how it occurred and what was going on around the world at that time was very, very helpful to me, just to understand how we've developed as humans. And it's quite sad in some ways to see that period of a flourishing period of humanism, and then we go back into wars and all the stuff later in the early 20th century. But I liked that period a lot. I don't know if it was my favorite, but I certainly found it one of the most fascinating to research. And the individuals involved, whether it was Copernicus and you're looking at astrology, or whether astronomy, sorry, or whether it was Leonardo da Vinci, who was not only obviously an artist but an inventor as well, or somebody like Michelangelo, who was just purely about sculpturing. He just wasn't interested in anything else. He was fanatical. And also just the age of exploration and how that took off around then. It was a wonderful period.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a period. I mean, it's a period of intense conflict as well. You have all of a sudden this kind of boost in literacy and the beginnings of mass printing, and so many of the ideas that were originally just simply kind of top down, essentially via the church, are suddenly contested. People can read the Bible and look at the bishops and go, "Oh, hold on a moment. There was no pope in Jesus' time, and why are you so rich?" And you have this, and people start to be able to do that and go, "Hang on, this story doesn't make sense." And you get your the religious Reformation, following the Renaissance. Absolutely. And I think in a way we're at a moment of kind of conflict and chaos now, which is partly due to, again, this extreme democratization of information and misinformation. The internet is doing in the 21st century what the Gutenberg
mass printing probably then allowed for the dissemination of good information, but poor information too, and we're seeing it again now. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And also you get to this moment where we're in these information silos where, well, my worldview is as valid as your worldview, and who's to say that these big things that we say have happened actually happened at all. And you get these horrible resurgence of things like Holocaust denial, or or people contesting slavery, simply because technology has empowered them to exist in these information silos, where you can select the facts that you prefer.
Most secure.
So that makes the task of creating a timeline, or the task of doing a kind of rather humble little podcast like this, I guess kind of important and worthwhile, and having to show that there has been this collective past for all of us, even though it is quite contested.
Absolutely. The other thing that it does, and again, so similar to your podcast or this book, whatever, but what I quite like about it is it helps sort of shrink history. And what I mean by that is, we live in an age now where the world is much smaller than it was for, our parents. It wasn't that long ago when if you had some relatives off in Australia and you wanted to go and visit them, it would be once in a lifetime journey if you could make it. And when you did, it was a 3 week, travel by ship. And then you jump forward, not many decades, and people are jumping on and off planes non-stop. And you jump forward another decade, and suddenly we're all on WhatsApp video calls with each other, and the world is much, much smaller through technology. But what I like about the book and the podcast, it also shrinks history, that time is not actually as long as we sort of necessarily think it is. There's not that much of a difference or gap between what happened 400 or 500 years ago and what's happening now.
No.
And you start seeing the links between them all.
No. And, the people, what we consider to be kind of modernity and what we consider modern people to be like, if you look at how people were, two or three, 400 years ago, not wildly different, different ways of understanding the world and, different access to technology and different living standards. But in terms of the kind of the moral or political or ideological sense they made of the world, not wildly different. But there, Bruce, we must finish in a moment. But it's been a real pleasure to have you on the podcast, and it would be great to have you back at some point to talk about timelines and histories. And there's a whole bunch of stuff I know is in the book that we never got to discuss. So briefly, let's do the plug. Anyway, let's do the plug. So it's Bruce's complete time. You tell it. Bruce's complete.
Sure. So my name is Bruce Tapping. There's a website coming out probably in the next week, which is brucetapping.com. And it's all about the book, which is Bruce's Timeline of Our World.
Right. Okay. Apologies.
And it is available in all your normal bookstores. So you can go, it's print on demand. You can go into your Waterstones or Blackwells, or if you're in the States, you can go into Barnes & Noble, or in South Africa, exclusive books, and order it. And it's obviously on Amazon, Amazon.com.
Okay. And if you can support your independent bookshop, please do. They're a valuable part of the kind of ecosystem of publishing and writing, and you'll miss them when they're gone. Bruce, a real pleasure, and we will speak again, no doubt. All the very best with the book. Take good care, and thank you so much for your time.
Nick, thank you very much.
Okay. All the very best. Bye.
Bye-bye.